All right, today we are jumping back to the 16th century to tackle a figure who, believe it or not, still gets people really fired up. His name is John Calvin. And seriously, this is a guy who's been called everything from a freedom fighter to a total tyrant. So today, we're going to try to unravel the puzzle of who he really was. Let's get into it.
So, what's the deal with this guy? Was he an iron-fisted ruler who wanted to create a religious state? A theocrat? Or was he actually a groundbreaking thinker who helped pave the way for modern democracy? People have been arguing about this for centuries, and for good reason. I mean, just look at the labels people have thrown at him. The Ayatollah of Geneva. That's pretty intense. But then you also have a revolutionary Democrat. Some say he's the spirit behind free market capitalism, while others call him the father of state socialism. How on earth can one person be the inspiration for so many wildly different, totally contradictory ideas? Well, that is the paradox we're here to unlock. And the master key, the secret to understanding all of this, is an idea right at the heart of his thinking, the doctrine of the two kingdoms. This was his framework, his mental map for figuring out the messy relationship between your faith and your life as a citizen. Okay, so Calvin argued that every single one of us lives under what he called a twofold government. It's not one big government trying to rule everything. No, he said there are two separate, totally legitimate authorities that operate in two very different parts of our lives. Let's break down what he meant. And this distinction is absolutely crucial. So on one side, you have the spiritual kingdom. This governs your inner life, your conscience, your soul. Its whole purpose is piety, your relationship with God. Then you have the political kingdom. This governs your outward behavior, your body, your actions in the world. Its goal is just to create a decent society, to promote good citizenship. For Calvin, they're as different as your soul and your body. Each has its own job to do. Now, you have to understand, in his day, this was a pretty radical idea. It was a kind of middle path wedged between the two giant political theories of the time. You had either a total fusion of church and state or a complete retreat from politics altogether. To see just how radical, check out this landscape. First, you had the medieval papacy, which for centuries taught that the church was supreme over the state. The pope was the ultimate authority. Then you had groups like the Anabaptists, who saw the state as hopelessly corrupt and thought true Christians should just check out of society. But Calvin comes along and carves out this third way, distinction. They're separate, he says, they have different jobs, but they aren't enemies. In fact, they can actually help each other. This idea that the spiritual kingdom moves forward through persuasion, not political power, was central to the whole Reformation. Martin Luther said it best with this amazing quote. He's basically saying, hey, I wasn't leading an army, I was just talking, teaching, maybe having a beer, and the ideas, the word, did all the heavy lifting. The job of spreading faith belongs to pastors, not politicians. Okay, so that's the theory, but how does it hold up when things get real? Let's look at a super high-stakes moment in history, the conspiracy of Amboise. It's 1560, and a bunch of French nobles are planning to kidnap their young king to stop the brutal persecution of Protestants. They figured Calvin would be their biggest cheerleader. They were wrong. Instead of a blessing, Calvin sent them this absolutely chilling warning. He was completely horrified by the plot. He predicted it would unleash a catastrophic civil war. Even though he was on their side theologically, he believed their method, private citizens trying to overthrow the government, was totally out of bounds. But hold on, this doesn't mean Calvin was a total pushover who thought you should always obey a tyrant. His ideas actually created a framework for resistance, but it came with two really strict rules. First, any resistance had to be led by what he called lesser magistrates. Think parliaments or local princes, not just a mob of angry citizens. And second, the goal had to be for the common good of the entire nation, not just to protect one religious group. So this raises a huge question, right? If the political world isn't supposed to be explicitly Christian, how can it ever produce anything good? Well, this brings us to the real engine of Calvin's political thought, two big ideas called common grace and natural law. Common grace is this incredible idea that God just gives good gifts like wisdom, artistic talent, scientific insight, a sense of justice to all people, whether they're believers or not. For Calvin, this explained why non-Christian civilizations throughout history could create breathtaking art, discover amazing scientific truths, and write really good, just laws. And here's Calvin in his own words. He's pretty much saying, look, if people who aren't Christians figure something out in physics or math, We should use it. It's a gift from God, and it doesn't matter who the mailman is. This was a really powerful blow against any kind of anti-intellectualism. And working right alongside common grace is the idea of natural law. This is the belief that God has basically written a fundamental moral code onto every human heart. We all have an innate sense of right and wrong, of fairness and justice, and that shared sense is the foundation any society can build its laws on. And this leads to a conclusion that is genuinely shocking. Because Calvin believed that every nation had access to this natural law, he argued that the government of ancient Israel, which was a theocracy, was not a blueprint for other nations. In fact, his whole system, by separating the two kingdoms, is the one thing that strictly forbids a theocracy. So if there's no single perfect form of government, what should they all be aiming for? Calvin's answer was one powerful word: equity. He saw this as a universal principle, a kind of perpetual rule of love that should guide every legal system everywhere. This allows for a huge variety of governments and laws, as long as they all are striving for that fundamental fairness. So now we can finally circle all the way back to our original paradox. Calvin himself was a pretty conservative guy, and he was deeply opposed to revolution, and yet his ideas had a revolutionary impact that he absolutely never intended or saw coming. And here's where we have to separate Calvin's personal opinion from his core principle. Did he have a favorite form of government? Yeah, he did. He kind of liked a mix of aristocracy and democracy. But, and this is the whole point, he never ever taught that his preference was a biblical command. His principle was that the Bible allows for many different forms of government, depending on the culture and the time. And let's finally put that Ayatollah of Geneva myth to bed. Far from seeing himself as some triumphant ruler who had perfected his city, this is what he said to Geneva's leaders on his deathbed: "You are trustees of a perverse and unhappy nation." That is hardly a victory lap. He saw the city as deeply flawed and his work there as incredibly fragile. So let's be super clear. Calvin himself was no modern Democrat, not even close. But by drawing that sharp line between the spiritual and political worlds, he accidentally gave later thinkers the theological tools they needed to build something new. His ideas became the intellectual soil where concepts like constitutional government, the right to resist tyrants, and eventually religious liberty could grow. It's a pretty incredible legacy, right? All born from this nuanced idea that just refuses to fit into our neat little boxes. And it leaves us with a pretty big question for our own time. In a world that feels more and more polarized, a world that often demands we fuse our faith and our politics, what can a 500-year-old idea about two separate kingdoms possibly teach us today?